Chapter 17. Sunday late afternoon. Doreen laughed. Sure. Why not? That works. With Muggs at her side, Goliath now walking in front of them, and Thaddeus still on her shoulder, she returned to her car. She really did want to take another look around the second-hand shop, but Jeremiah had followed her and locked up behind her. Setting her precious possessions into the back of the car, she loaded Muggs up in the front and said, "What do you think? Should we take a trip downtown and see if Peter happens to be there?" Muggs woofed at her. Thaddeus cackled and Goliath stared at her, bored. She nodded. Right, we should. The location wasn't too far away. Likely a 10-minute drive. Not as far as Glenmore. Finally, she was getting to know the Kelowna area. As soon as she found the right set of corners, she pulled into an adjacent street, parked, hopped out, and checked to see if she needed to pay, but being a weekend, it was free. Delighted, she turned to her animals and said, "Let's go for a walk." But rather than hitting the front street, she hit the alleyways. She came across a group of 3 men huddled together, snoozing on the sidewalk. She studied their faces carefully, but she didn't see any resemblance to Jeremiah. She kept on until she accidentally tripped across the shelter. Studying it, she walked around to the side, and there was a single man sitting on a bench with a cup of coffee. He looked like a possible candidate. She walked up to him and asked, "Are you Peter?" He raised his eyebrows in surprise but appeared friendly enough. "I was just speaking to your father," she said, taking a seat on the bench beside him. This time he seemed more shocked than anything. Yet he still appeared approachable. "I'm Doreen," she said as she reached out a hand to shake his. And then she knew she'd surprised him yet again when he shuffled his coffee to his other hand and shook hers. It was a rusty move, as if not many people wanted to do that with him anymore. His hand was dirty and dry, but she made herself shake it as if it were the best gentleman's hand in a boardroom. Then she smiled at him and said, "I don't know if you've heard anything about all the cold cases that have been closing in this town." He nodded his head slowly. "It's about time somebody looked into them." His voice was raspy, as if he had inhaled too many cigarettes in a short time. "Indeed," she said. "Well, I'm one of the people who has been involved." He looked down at Muggs and looked back at her, then said with a gasp, "You're the crazy lady with the animals." She winced at that. She lifted her hair back to show him Thaddeus, who was tucked up against her neck. The man's eyes grew rounder. And then he reached up a hand halfway but dropped it. "Does he stay like that?" he asked. "Yes," she said, "most of the time. He's happy to walk around on my shoulder too." Thaddeus lifted his head, squawked at the man, and said, "Thaddeus is here. Thaddeus is here." Peter chuckled. "Wow, he talks." "He does talk," she said, realizing how much of an icebreaker the animals were in this situation. "His name is Thaddeus and this is Muggs." And then she pointed to the cat, wandering around a fire hydrant not too far away. Muggs wanted to go too, but she had him on a leash. "And that's Goliath." Peter looked at the 3 and then smiled. "You're the bone lady," he said with satisfaction. "The one who's been helping out with all these cold cases." She nodded. "Yes, that's exactly who I am." He looked at the animals curiously and asked, "What do you want with me?" "Manny," she said gently. "I thought maybe somebody should look into Manny's disappearance." Instead of the reaction she expected to get, his eyes filled with tears. "I'd be so grateful," he whispered, "if you could." "I can look, but I can't guarantee I'll find any answers," she warned him. "Of course not," he said, "but anything is something." "What can you tell me about his last few days before he went missing?" Doreen asked as she put her phone on record, so she'd have it for later. "It was business as usual," Peter said. "I've racked my brain, trying to find any clue that would make a difference, but I just never do." "So tell me, what did you tell the police?" He shrugged. For a couple days, we were just sitting around, doing our usual drugs and tricks and more drugs and more tricks. His voice was neutral and without inflection, as if he'd said it many times before. And then he took a John, and I never saw him again. And who was the John? No clue, Peter said. I've never seen him around here. At least, I don't think so. So was that common? He nodded. Yeah. Sometimes they travel here for the tricks. Sometimes their friends would direct them to other locations. Or if they're not used to hiring prostitutes, they don't want to be seen returning to the same location too often. Kelowna is a big tourist town, so you know. Anybody who's used to hiring prostitutes doesn't think anything of hiring one in a new location. What about the vehicle? Can you tell me about that? He looked at her. His gaze was a little fuzzy as he said, it was a truck. A black truck. Double cab, full-size bed. Did it have lots of flashy shiny chrome on it? I don't remember, he said, perplexed. The cops didn't ask me about the truck at all. I'm sure they asked you what vehicle it was. Depending on when they asked, he said, I may or may not have told them the truth. Because I was often under the influence of drugs myself. Think back now, Doreen urged. And sometimes the best way to do that is to sit back quietly and think about your friend and the last time you saw him. Did he wave at you when he got into this new John's truck? Did he give you a thumbs-up sign? Did he smile and tell you that he'd be back in 10 and roll his eyes because this guy looked like he would be a penny pincher? Peter laughed at that. It's almost like you know him because he'd do things like that all the time. He thought more about it and smiled. Then he said, he gave me the thumbs-up sign and a little finger wave, so I'd know he was pretty excited about it. And that would mean what? That he would be good-looking, fit, or maybe there was money in his hand? All of those things, he said. Money was important because it was our next fix. Did he do tricks for you to get drugs too? She asked gently. He nodded. Sometimes. It's been 6 months since I had my last hit. It's hard, but I'm slowly weaning my way off them. She looked at him in delight. That's wonderful news. You should tell your father. He'd be so proud. I don't want to tell him, Peter said. Not yet. Not until I make it a whole year. It seems like 10 days forward and 1 day back, and I know how easy it is to slide. And I don't want to slide this time, so I don't want to tell him that I'm clean and then have a relapse and have him be disappointed all over again. I understand that, Doreen said. Okay, so back to Manny. He hopped into this black truck. Did it have, interesting wheels? Did it have chrome? Was Manny short? Did he have trouble getting up into the rig? It had those checkered pattern step-up sides, he said, and a bed liner with the same thing. Interesting, Doreen said. That's a good detail. And he used it to get in because he was how tall? About 5'7", he said, a little bit taller than average for a woman but not much. Great, and was he? Doreen stopped at that point, not sure how to phrase it. Peter looked at her curiously. I don't want to be indelicate, she said. I'm not sure how to phrase this, but was he doing tricks as a man or as a woman? Peter nodded with understanding. That was the thing about Manny. He would do both. It would depend on what the guy wanted. It was all about the money. Some days, if it wasn't going well, he'd dress up real pretty in the hopes of turning the day around. Doreen wasn't exactly sure how that would work. She gave a head shake. And on that day, he was dressed as a guy. Yes, Peter said, and he hopped up and they took off. I was sitting right here, and the truck headed on down that way. He pointed down the road on Richter Street. How long would he normally be for a job like that? Sometimes they just pulled around the corner to the parking lot, and he'd hop out of there when they were done, and would be back in 20 minutes, he said. The fact that he drove away meant they'd be a couple hours. And you were just sitting here, waiting for him to come back? I was just over there, not on this bench. Sitting on the side of the road, he said, as he pointed to the curbside where a big garden was. Right. So you were sitting there, having a smoke, and waiting? He nodded. Anybody else come by? He shrugged. That was a long time ago. Nothing was wrong in my mind until I didn't see Manny. I fell asleep somewhere around here. The city park is just across from here, and I often go there to snooze. And when would you have expected to see him? During the night, or in the morning? Either or both, Peter said. It would be a case of need. You know, I'd have seen him in the nighttime, if he came and woke me up, or if I happened to be awake. Or at least in the morning. Where would he sleep? In a bed with the John if he could. Otherwise, sometimes he'd sleep on this bench or across the road in the park with me. So neither of you had rooms anywhere? No, all our money went to drugs. As I look back, all I see is wasted lives. But remember, you're doing something about it now, Doreen said. For 6 months. And that is something you should reward yourself for every day. You have successfully completed 6 months. Right, he said with a smile. Now, if I can make it past all that mentally, it would be perfect. Doreen nodded and smiled. I get it. Is there anything else you can tell me? Did Manny have any enemies? Did anybody make any threats against him? Do you think any other women around at that time might have wanted that John for their own? Those are good questions, Peter said in admiration. I don't think the cops asked me anything like that either. Well, let's ask them now and see what we can come up with.